Ladies and gentlemen, children of all ages, welcome to another CryptoManiacs podcast. And we're streaming everywhere. Like I said just before we went live, Task, we're even on YouTube now. So we're everywhere, man. We're like a really annoying cousin. We're just everywhere. Task, how was your weekend, man? That's what everyone wants to know.
My weekend was very eventful. I made some videos. I wrote some articles. I did some commenting and some upvoting on Hive. So I basically did nothing different. Hey, by the way, gentlemen, today is Tuesday, and happy two day to you. It's 2/22, 2022. So we got
Yes.
a lot of twos going.
Yes, and we are welcoming back. This has been one that was marked down on the calendar for a bit, and I know a lot of people were excited for this. We're welcoming back Blocktrades. The man, the myth, the legend is back again with us. So we got to. Last week, Arcane set up that Hive Buzz badge for me, and I've got to set it out because Blocktrades. This is, I think, your third time, man. Welcome back.
It's been 3 now. Okay.
Yeah.
He's on the leaderboard.
Yeah, he is. That's what I mean. We got to get those badges out to everybody, right? I mean.
Hey, you're the technical guru.
So I get a CryptoManiacs badge now?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Arcane designed a CryptoManiacs badge for guests on CryptoManiacs.
Very cool.
And John is fully in charge of them. So if you don't get it, throw the virtual tomatoes at John and not me.
He sent me a list of how to do it, right? And like it's not like it's easy, but I mean sometimes people don't understand how lack of technical abilities I have. Anything that requires more than me like typing hello in a keyboard it's a write-off. So it's going to take some time, but we'll get the badges out to all the guests. But so Blocktrades is back, appearance number 3. So lots of stuff to talk about. As always, I'm looking forward to this one, and I know Task is too. So let's get into it, shall we, Task?
Yeah, I figure we would be remiss, and we'd probably get stoned or have people like say bad things about us if we didn't bring up this topic, because it is on everybody's mind. It is hard fork season. I might be mistaken, but last I read, the target was end of March. Is that still your target date? And I know everybody's talking about the resource credit delegations, but what are some of the features that are going to be in this hard fork that you want to highlight?
So I guess addressing the date first, I think it's unlikely at this point we'll be able to release into March. That was always an aggressive schedule, and I hope to free up some resources to work on sort of the remaining things. And that work was supposed to have started about a week ago, and it didn't. So at this point, my guess we're probably talking middle April, I think is most likely, somewhere in April.
So 2 to 3 week delay off your aggressive plans. Okay.
Yeah, I think so. Mainly because I want to be sure we have a lot of testing time. And last discussion I had with the Polish team on their work is, they want to have a lot of time for testing everything. So as far as things to highlight, in some way, the biggest thing is it's not really a hard fork feature, but we're going to release it with the hard fork. And that is, hold on just a second. What's going on in there? Okay, it sounds like a UPS. Maybe you could help him out. Okay. Sorry. Have a beeping noise in the background here, which you guys probably don't hear, but just want to be sure everything was okay there. The fun of UPSs and their little beeps. Okay, so half is really probably the biggest thing I think to highlight, even though, like I said, it's not a hard fork feature per se. It's going to come out around the same time as the hard fork, because it basically, in order to run half, people are going to want to upgrade their Hive D clients. So it just makes sense, I think, to do it during hard fork time, because everybody's got to upgrade for all our witnesses and API nodes have got to upgrade for the hard fork anyways. So just do it all at once. So that's why, I mean, you could test half now and people could mess around with it now, but there wouldn't be like any public half servers yet.
Yeah, well, and that actually leads into because I know this is a project that's near and dear to you, since you were the one who devised it and even created the name. Um, to delve into a little bit of Half, would it be accurate for me to say that Half is basically a database manager, or is that incorrect?
Um, it could be viewed that way. I mean, it could be viewed a lot of different ways. I view it as just a programming framework, which means it's an environment for somebody to write Hive code in. That it's kind of like a way to write your Hive app in a way that you can guarantee that it's going to be error free. It works with the database, right? So that's it does involve database coding, that's for sure. But what it does is it gets the data from the blockchain, puts it into the database. It manages the way blockchain data gets into the database and possibly gets removed from the database. Because like in a blockchain, you can have forks where blocks get removed because they didn't get approved by enough witnesses, for instance. So if not enough witnesses see a block, that block just disappears. And so in Half will see that block originally. Maybe Half server might see the block. The applications will then process that block. But then if that block doesn't get approved by enough witnesses and it goes away, then all those apps have to basically forget about that block and everything that they did as a result of that block being received. So that's what we call the Hive fork manager. And that's one of the most important technically components of Half, is that ability to handle blocks going away and being changed. Because otherwise your app winds up in a state where it thinks things happen that the blockchain says didn't happen.
Is that a common occurrence across the blockchain world? I mean,
it depends a little bit. So forks definitely happen, and they can be rare. I guess I should also differentiate. There's sort of two different kinds of forks. So there's one kind of fork, which is when people intentionally create a fork. Mm-hmm. And that's when, like, you have Bitcoin and then somebody says, well, I want my code to run differently. So they make Bitcoin Cash, which just literally operates differently. So that's an intentional fork. Mm-hmm. But a more common type of fork is a non-intentional fork, which is like you have a network connectivity problem. So somebody produces a block, the other nodes, you get that block and they build on top of that block. But if enough nodes don't receive that new block, then a few nodes might build off that block, the other ones build off another block. And that's a fork too. And so there's code in most blockchains to then deal with the fact that they've got nodes that are in disagreement. And they come back to agreement through something called fork resolution. And usually it's something like the longest chain wins idea, whichever blockchain has the longest. They see that the nodes communicate with each other and say, oh, you've got a longer chain than I do. I need to switch to your chain, for instance. So yeah, forks happen, and how often they happen can depend on a lot of things. One of the things it depends on is how fast you produce your blocks. So if you produce your blocks very slowly, then there's plenty of time for nodes to figure out that for a new block to get passed around to all the nodes. But if your blockchain is very fast, like Hive is, there's more chance for somebody to go off on a fork temporarily. The most common case is like somebody produces a block too late and it arrives on time to some of the other nodes, but not enough of them to be counted as a proper block. And in the meantime, everybody else has accepted some other block. So we call it we call that a micro fork. It's it's a quick blip, and it might only be a block or two long. So but if your application is actually processing right at the head block, then yeah, you can have to deal with those kind of problems.
And from the blockchain perspective, it sounds like this is resolved in 6, 9, 12 seconds. It's resolved very quickly, correct?
It can be. It's not always. If you had like a real connectivity problem, like say your internet split, say the cables got cut between Europe and America, for instance, and then you could have a fork that lasts for a while, right? Because the nodes can't connect up.
Oh, okay, I see what you're saying.
So if there's it depends on the nature of the interruption. If it's just a slow versus actual loss of connection between nodes, as far as how long a fork lasts. But yeah, typically micro forks are very quick and they get resolved very quickly within a matter of seconds.
Now, you mentioned something interesting, speed. Is this regardless of how the format is. So proof of work versus proof of stake. It really doesn't matter. It's more the speed, or is this
Yeah.
more a proof of stake as opposed to proof of work situation?
It's really mostly about the speed.
Okay.
If you've got speed requirements, it does depend a little bit on how your blockchain's set up, but what the rules are for accepting a new block do matter. But like, for instance, if you've got one where you've scheduled the witnesses ahead of time, and you know which block they're supposed to generate in the next round, which is what Hive and most DPoS systems do, then there's kind of a little more clarity on who's supposed to be producing the next blocks. If you're dealing with something like Bitcoin, it's like any of the nodes, any of the miners can potentially they're all competing to generate the next block, and it's just a race. So I suppose actually you could probably argue that if those were running really fast, they would have more likely to have forking problems, because there would be more, if they could run fast and generate blocks very quick. One guy might see a block, they says, oh yeah, that's the first block, but then another guy at a different place would say, oh no, that's the first block. So forks would actually happen very commonly in a proof of work if your proof of work was very quick to calculate and you could publish it right away. So the fact that it takes a long time to calculate is important for a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin to actually not have major forking problems.
I'm going off a little into the never land here, but this is interesting. Is proof of work, does that have the capability to be fast, or is it intentionally slowed down? Because
I think it's intentionally slowed down. I think
Okay.
I mean, when I sit there and think about it, if I could solve a proof of work problem in say 100 milliseconds, a tenth of a second, and it takes a second for my block to transmit across the ocean to blockchain nodes over there, then you'd have this problem where a lot of different nodes would be producing blocks in that 150 millisecond range. So they might be arriving at, each one of those would be arriving at different times at different nodes, and you'd constantly have forks. So your time of your block has to be a lot longer than the time of transmission to be safe.
And so what I would presume then is there is some type of ceiling on exactly how fast a proof of work system can go, because there's a point where
if it was cheap to consistently, I mean, it's not like in Bitcoin right now, somebody could theoretically find the next block, in 10 milliseconds and publish it, and that would work okay as long as they were the only one doing that. But if a bunch of nodes were generating blocks in that range, then it would get to real confusion as to which block was the real winner.
Understood. Okay. And bringing back to Half now. So what Half does, if I'm understanding correctly, is any application developer is able to tie into Half, but I guess Half is going to eliminate the problem of the micro forking from the application development standpoint. It'll still happen, and it's still part of the blockchain ecosystem, but Half kind of sits in the middle there and says, okay, you app developers, you don't need to worry about this, because what Half puts forth is going to be the updated and the post fork stuff. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah. So let me go a little detail about how it actually works, but that's essentially correct. It hides the forking, sort of. So the way it works is a block comes out, your application processes that block. It might create data based off that block. So it's recorded off some information about who, that somebody voted for something, for instance. And it says, okay, now I've got a record that says this guy voted for this. And maybe it's keeping track of how many votes for that particular post. Then that block gets blown away, and it now needs to uncount that vote that it counted earlier. In a normal situation, it would have to say, oh, you would have to send a message that this block has gone away. Then this app would have to rescan the block and reverse everything it did based off that block in its code. So it had to write, like, I call it undo code, that would undo every operation in that block. But that's a pain in the neck, because that if you have to write an undo for every processing transaction, everything you do when you process a block, then it's just more work. So basically what Half does is it knows what the state of your database was before you process that block. Then you update to the state that is after the block. But if it sees the block goes away, it can automatically revert the state of your database back to the state it was at before the block. So it takes care of, you don't have to write any undo code. It undoes your changes to the database, your application's changes to the database automatically. And you tell it what you want it to undo. You basically say, all these tables, if any change happen, if I lose some number of blocks, revert all the changes associated with those blocks in my tables. And the tables are basically your app's data.
Gotcha. So the benefit to this, it sounds like, is it's a lot less headaches for app developers, if for no other reason than they don't have to write that undo code. So it makes that process a lot more efficient. But I would imagine that there's a lot of developers, especially those who are, how should I say, novel to the blockchain world, who might not even be aware of that, or might
yes,
be
I'm very sure a lot of them don't even realize they need to write that kind of code. So,
okay,
yeah. So they don't even write it, right? It doesn't get written.
So basically, if we're connecting the dots, what Half will do is this will open up the programming of applications to a much wider pool of developers than presently are right now. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely correct. And the programming model is more favorable for larger number of programmers too. So the basic programming model is SQL database programming, which is one of the most common forms of programming out there, really. And it doesn't require you to learn like a specialized language. Like if you want to go program in Ethereum, for instance, you want to write a smart contract in Ethereum, you basically got to learn a specialized language that they created just for Ethereum. Mm-hmm. And that puts a big restriction on how many programmers can just start up and write code for it.
Well, and what you mentioned that I recall from the last time you were on, what happens there is you have people who are learning the code. They are fairly adept at creating the code, but they don't have a great in-depth knowledge of the code. So they have not only bugs, but they have security flaws just out of ignorance. They didn't know. And so all of a sudden you have these smart contracts out there with security flaws that can be exploited.
Yeah, that's exactly correct.
And so Half will allow people to operate in programming languages that they've been using for years and years and years. So what they design, if they have any expertise in that programming language, should be fairly secure.
Yes, they have a lot more background in what they're doing, so they're more aware of what are the good practices and bad practices when it comes to writing the code.
And the final piece that I have with Half is, well, actually, I got two more points to this, but one is this also, it allows applications to tap into Half, but it keeps still everything else off the blockchain, right? So the blockchain is still kept tight and neat and condensed as compared to the Half, which can expand and grow. And as more developers create more stuff and open source it and share it, that'll grow, and that menu or library will grow. But the blockchain is still, okay, we have these very specific functions at the blockchain level, and nothing messes with that.
Yep, that's correct.
Okay, now from a I don't know what you call it, a technical standpoint, where is Half resident? Is this going to have its own servers, or is this integrated right into the API servers?
It'll be definitely integrated into the API servers. For one thing, we're taking several of the functionalities that the API servers had and replace them with Half components. So one of the things an API server does is what we call account history. And that means you can ask an API server all the transactions and activities done by a particular account, right? So you can say what are the transfer history of this account over the past week? And there's a specific API call that does that. And right now that API call goes to the Hive node itself, the blockchain node. But those calls put a lot of load on the Hive node servers, and potentially you could even like overwhelm one with enough traffic, right? So right now there's rate limits and things set on API nodes to prevent them from being overwhelmed by that kind of traffic. So it's one of the more expensive calls. These are some of the more expensive calls that get made. So basically we're offloading all that into a Half application. That's what we call Halfa. Don't ask why that name ever got created. I blame someone else for that one. But anyways, it essentially stands for half account history node, and it's a replacement for running a whole Hive D node that keeps track of account history. And the advantage of a Halfa server, Halfa running on a half server, is that it's much quicker and it can handle a much greater load of activity without really placing a lot of CPU strain on the server. So that's really our first completed major half application is Halfa. The other big one we're working on is Hive Mind. So we're changing Hive Mind into a half application as well. And so between those two, that's two of the major API components on an API node. So it would be easy to say at that point that most of the API, a large portion of the API calls will actually be will be running on a half server. And that's great because it takes off the load off your Hive D node. So those nodes, which are kind of the critical ones, those are the ones that are running the blockchain itself. Those don't get too loaded down.
And it sounds like this is leading me into my next topic. And it was something that you and I kind of joked about. I believe it was in the comment section of one of your posts. Maybe it was one of my posts. But about what you do your waking hours and what you think about. And we had Archange on here last week, and this guy lives, breathes, and bleeds security. And you seem to breathe scaling. And it sounds like Half is going to enable for greater scaling and optimization, at least in that area of the ecosystem. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely what Half is really aimed at, is basically scaling blockchain technology itself, because blockchain technology right now is in current forms has been quite limited into how much it can handle. So really what we're doing is looking how to make blockchain scale to, be able to compete essentially with centralized services.
And that kind of brings into, since the last time you were here, I don't know, it's been 6, maybe 7 months. And I know you had mentioned that a lot of the first year after the Hive major fork, you spent on optimization and scaling and making the blockchain a lot more efficient, not only from an operations perspective, but also a cost perspective, which is obviously very important. And the last 6 months, just reading your weekly or every other week posts, you talk about Half and some of the other things. Do you have anybody just dedicated to optimization and scaling, or is this just something you go about your business on a regular basis, but it's always at the forefront of your mind? So every opportunity to tighten up some code or to get some steps out of the way, you're always looking to take advantage of that.
It's a little bit of both. I mean, we knew about problems and scaling problems and performance issues when we first started. And also, as we got into it, we could see other places that needed work improvements and things like that. And so they got scheduled in that we'll get to them when we get to them. And that's kind of, so, we've known about a lot of these issues for a long time, and some of it, right, like I said, right away, some of it through observation. And yeah, we still, of course, look for ways to improve, look for potential problems that we're not aware of. Yeah, that's kind of an always ongoing thing. And we find them in a lot of different ways. Sometimes we find it by watching performance of our API node and just seeing, when it gets loaded down and why and how and things like that. But other times we look at the code and we're like, oh, wait, that could be done better. So it's a combination of a lot of different things as far as how you find out something can be improved performance-wise.
Yeah, and I know that there's a lot of code that when, after the fork, it quite frankly hadn't been looked at years and years and years. So you guys were tasked with having to go through that, and you kind of, like you said,
yeah, we still learn things. Even now, we still learn things about the code.
Look at the date of the update, 2014. Oh, okay. Well, maybe we ought to address this a little bit. Because scaling is something, and to the layperson, I don't know. We think of scaling as, okay, well, it's a Ferrari or it's a rocket ship, and I mean, it's just make everything go faster, faster, faster. But from your end of things, I'm sure you see it in a different manner, and optimization and things like that. And you know, we basically look at it from the non-technical end of things is just how much can we take place, and basically everybody talks, well, your transactions per second, and you know, Ethereum or Bitcoin does 8 and Ethereum does 20 or whatever. And of course, then you got Visa out there doing 20,000 a second or whatever. And that's the extent that we look at. And obviously, just from, you know, the start of this show, you explained how there's just so many different components. But I guess my question is, and, you know, I don't know how you're going to answer this other than just maybe general, or if there's a couple metrics you want to pull out. Where do you think our scaling capability is now in terms of what we could throw at this blockchain as it stands now? And then try to maybe contrast that or give us an idea when half fully does go live and is in operation. You know, will there be a marked increase there? And I don't know if you talk transactions per second or number of whatever metrics you want to use. Is there some way you could maybe frame that for us?
Yeah, so I guess interestingly, it's definitely not transactions per second in this case for half. So you could look at two forms. Let's talk about two forms of loading. So the form we're talking about right now is basically new transactions getting included into the database. And that's one form of loading, right? So there's definitely an upper limit on that. And, you know, we try to make that faster. But the other form of loading is API nodes get a loading from servers talking to those API nodes. So every person who's on a web page on hive.blog or eSense or PeakD, each one of those web pages is talking to an API server to get the data. And the more of those people, more people running that server, the more hits that server takes. So this is unrelated to the transactions processed by the blockchain. So it's like the transactions to the blockchain are like writing data to the blockchain. API calls are like reading the data that's been written to the blockchain. So one of the things Half is really working on is how to read the blockchain data faster and deliver it up faster to consumers like web pages, applications. So a lot of what happens, a lot of the strain as you scale up is actually on the reading side. You get more and more people wanting to look at the blockchain data and read it. And that's really where Half shines, is making that part more scalable.
Oh, okay. So when and I'll use this one just to drive John nuts. When Ethereum, you see, like at times people start talking about like Ethereum and, oh, their transactions are backed up, 2 days or whatever. Is that because they just have so much that their writing is just taking that long to catch up? Is that why it's delayed?
Yeah. So the writing might not be just the time it takes to write it, though. It's also time that. So when you make a transaction, then the blockchain node has to process that transaction, figure out what it needs to do based on that transaction, and then it puts it in the block once it approves it that it's okay. But that processing time can be an upper limit on how fast you can get data into your blockchain. So if you're running smart contracts and those smart contracts take a long time to run, that can delay how fast you can write data into your blockchain. So it's basically the processing of blockchain operations that usually sets the upper limit on how fast your blockchain can run. It can also be your networking. If your peer-to-peer network isn't designed well, that can also cause problems. But generally speaking, right now, mostly it's the time to process transactions that sets the upper limit on the write speed. So if you do that efficiently, you can process more transactions per second. And I think that's one of the areas where Hive is already quite good. It has a very fast ability to process transactions very quickly. But where it still needed some work, I think, because the side that scales, that only scales so fast because only so many people need to create new transactions per second, right? But if you think about it, how many times do you write a transaction versus you look at a web page that has transaction data on it? That happens a lot more commonly, and that's where you really need to be able to scale well.
Yeah, and a lot of it, to be honest with you, if I give an upvote, if that takes a few extra seconds to be written to the blockchain, is it the end of the world? No. But if I click on a page to try to read a comment, I want the comments there. I want the latest updated comment. And if it's not there, it's like, well, what happened?
Or if your whole page doesn't render and you're just staring at a blank screen for a couple seconds.
Yeah, we have that. Of course, of late in the last couple months, that may be just major parts of the internet down.
Yeah, that could definitely happen too.
Like Facebook. So, okay, so basically, what we're going to have with, we'll call it post half. So starting in, we'll give you a little time, and let's say in May, half should be up and running. And so now we will have a lot more optimization, not only on the write side, but also on the read side, which will help the loading of APIs and different applications getting the data from the website or from the blockchain, excuse me.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's I say it's reading, but it's a little bit more than reading too, because there is a writing side to half. So there's the blockchain data, which is all transactions per second. But then there's like secondary data that gets created from the blockchain data. So as an example, if you had a vote counter that was counting how many times a post has been voted on, each transaction increments that vote counter. That's additional data that's getting written for every vote. And so that's like an application doing that. So that Hive Mind might be doing that, for instance. That's an application running on the Hive blockchain. Or you're playing a game and the transaction says you attack somebody, then it's got to calculate things and write out the results of that attack to its own database. So all those are writes. And you do want those writes to be fast too. In other words, your application has to keep up with the speed of the blockchain. So you do want to have it kind of designed, your half application. This helps you design an application that can keep up with the blockchain as it's running at its full speed.
And so now that you've explained this and kind of peeled back some of the layers for us, this is why when you get more users, that things tend to bottleneck and slow down. Is the blockchain will still process the way the blockchain does, but it's all these different layers and all these different types of applications that are tying in. And with more users and more transactions, if you don't optimize the different facets before it gets to the blockchain, you end up with bottleneck anyway.
That's right. Right. So your application might slow down so that it can't even create new transactions to put to the blockchain because it's so busy answering questions from its players or trying to process actions from its players.
And you mentioned that you're looking at half, maybe creating a little more parity between the centralized systems and blockchain, which you said, which everybody I think knows is notorious for being much slower and clunky and not being able to operate in an efficient manner, much like the centralized systems. You're saying that half is going to close that gap a little bit and put us on a little bit more of a par than.
Yeah, I think we'll be pretty close to one to one actually.
Really?
Yeah, because I mean, a lot of what half does is it basically gets a lot of the same advantages that the centralized services normally have.
Gotcha. So then it just comes down to the technical specs of the servers that it's being run on and things of that nature, and the processing speed and memory, and just how beefy the actual hardware is then.
That's right. And so let me give you one example of an advantage that a centralized service has. A centralized service only needs to run its application. If you're running a smart contract platform, you've got to run all the smart contracts that get published on there, and you don't even have a choice about it. Every contract that gets published, you have to run. So you have to run. It's a lot more. You're basically running all that on a single server. So that's one disadvantage right now to a decentralized system, using smart contracts, is that it has to run every application. So with half, you don't have to do that. You can make a half server and you can pick and choose as a half operator. You can choose what applications you want to run on your server. If you want, you can just run your application. That's it. Just like a centralized server guy can. But it's still, the transactions are still taking place on a blockchain. They're still immutable. They're still provable, all those kind of things.
Gotcha. So it is providing a lot of flexibility to the developers as to what they want to pick and choose and how they want to design their own half. They can either use, I guess, the half in, the different APIs, or they can queue up their own server and put in what they want, correct?
That's right. So we'll probably have a standard half server that has like everything that, is like we'll make up like, we'll have it like with the basic ones, like account history and Hive Mind, for instance. So you'll be able to download a half server that you can configure to have run Hive Mind and account history. So if you just want to run a standard API node, you could grab that. Or you could pick and choose. You could say, okay, I just want the account history. I don't want Hive Mind, or vice versa. So you have more control over it's basically the API operators is who this really gives control to. It's not so much the devs as whoever's running a half server. A half server operator can choose what applications he wants to run on it. So if he just thinks it's useful to support some game, he could say, look, I'll run your game software on my server, and people can ping my server for information about the game.
Gotcha. So this to me sounds like if I'm developing an application or a game or whatever I'm doing, a lot of the selling points of Hive are, well, we have very fast transaction time. We have feeless transactions. And now it sounds like we are going to have, because of Hive, very flexible, I don't know what to call it, development options, as opposed to if you're going with a lot of the other blockchains out there, it's like, here it is, and you have to take everything, and no a la carte here. It's you have everything, or you build it all yourself.
I'd say it's called deployment. I think of it as a deployment issue. So deployment of software. So in a smart contract system, it's basically, if you run a smart contract node, if you will, you're basically promising that I'll run any application that meets these requirements. So, which means you're going to run everyone that gets published. You don't have control over it. And that's sometimes useful, right? That has some advantages. On the other hand, if you don't want to do that, half allows you to say, okay, I'm just going to run the ones that I want to run. And if you want to convince me to run yours, to come talk to me, and maybe I'll deploy your application. But it's a deployment issue as to whether the software gets automatically deployed to the server, or whether the operator specifically says, I do or don't want to run this application. That's essentially the primary difference between smart contract platforms and something like Half, which is just a second layer, is that there's this difference in choice. And this difference in choice also comes with a couple other like side effects. With this, not only does, if you're running the smart contract platform, you say you're going to let anybody that meets those requirements run on your server, but that means you have to put some requirements on what you're allowed to run on your server too. Smart contracts put limitations on how you can write an application for safety reasons, because you don't want somebody to just be able to run any kind of software on your server, because they could steal data from your server, just crash it, do whatever they want, basically, take over your server and give it to them. So those are all issues that, in order to avoid those issues, smart contracts run in what's called a sandbox. It's basically or jail. It's like a special region of the computer that it can't do other things. It's prevented from doing a lot of things that might allow you to take over the server. So that's kind of a limitation you have to. It's similar to like JavaScript. If you're familiar with JavaScript running on web pages, JavaScript runs and it runs on your computer, runs software on your computer, but it can't just go randomly and grab files from your computer. Otherwise, you go to somebody's web page and they could start stealing files off your computer.
Gotcha. So it's a way to partition it. You mentioned the key word there a number of times, smart contract, and we did touch upon this a little bit last time. And one of the features of Hive is that there are no smart contracts at the base layer. It seems like the decision is thus far to keep the base coding very tight, very focused, very limited. And so smart contracts are layer 2. Get them off for security's sake, for efficiency's sake, for a few different reasons. And there was a rumor floating out there, and I think we discussed it, and it probably came from you, that you were thinking about doing a smart contract project or a smart contract layer. Have you thought any more about that? Have you worked on that anymore? Has it been put into action, or has it been bagged? Any info there?
Indirectly, it's been worked on. So basically, our plan was always to build it on top of Half.
Oh, okay.
So having Half basically completed now, I mean, we're still making improvements, but Half is really at a release state at this point. So we're pretty much ready to start building the smart contract platform on it next, which next in this case means after the hard fork, because we're going to be testing for, the next month. And there's a few more things we want to do in Hive D too. So we'll be basically starting that up somewhere, I guess, late April, I suspect, as far as the smart contract platform that gets built on top. But a lot of it is built already because of Half. Because remember how I mentioned the important thing about having a smart contract platform is that sandboxing, that protection of the system. So we're basically going to use SQL, which is that's the language of a database that runs as our smart contract language. And that means that we've already got the sandboxing, because SQL Postgres servers already have sandboxing technology built in. So it's like you basically have to choose some kind of sandbox language when you make a smart contract language. So like you could choose JavaScript. That's a common one that has been used a couple of times for smart contract engine, because it's a sandbox language. So we're kind of going a different route using SQL as our smart contract language.
And there's that familiarity again.
Exactly. Although, admittedly, there's plenty of people familiar with JavaScript too. They're both.
Well, yeah, but going back,
but it's better than say Solidity.
Yeah, I was going to say, going back, compare that to Solidity, which how many people out there really understand Solidity?
Yeah,
and are really willing to learn it. Moving on, and that's good. So, by the way, I would presume, and I'll put a little bug in your ear, we'll probably see a post from the Blocktrades account about that after the hard fork, I would presume, maybe detailing what some of your plans are with it. I know you're a supporter of this, or I believe you're a supporter of this. What are your thoughts on the Hive-backed dollar?
I think it's pretty crucial to the platform, because, I mean, Hive is always going to be a speculative currency. I think that's just not likely to change. So we need something that we need some kind of coin for commerce that's somewhat stable against base goods. It doesn't have to be the dollar, of course. It could be anything, but we need something. It could be the euro, or it could just be, I heard somebody suggest Big Macs coin. So there's like a Big Mac index apparently. But anyways, yeah, I think in some form or another we need a coin that makes it easy, because otherwise it's problematic, especially in any kind of long-term contracts. I mean, that's why we used Hive-backed dollars for the proposal system. It came out of my experience working in BitShares, where we saw that you got paid in the cryptocurrency BitShares, which was very volatile in nature. So you'd hire a programmer to work at, for, $100 an hour, and then suddenly you were paying him $1,000 an hour, or you're paying him $10 an hour. It's not a happy way to get your work done when no one side or the other is never happy in that transaction. They'd be either upset that they were overpaying him now, or he'd be upset because he promising this work for not enough money. So you kind of need a stable currency to do for transactions. And I mean, if they're quick, it doesn't matter so much. If your transactions are quick in nature, it doesn't really matter whether you pay in Hive or HBD. But any kind of longer term contract, you really need a stable currency. The value of it's not going to change too rapidly.
Well, I mean, you just think about, the price of Hive dropped, I think 10 or 11% in the last 24 hours. And it seemed like a lot of that move was at least for me, for those of us in the East of the U.S., it was overnight. And can you imagine being a merchant who sells products on your store, and somebody buys it at 9 o'clock at night and you don't check, but you wake up at 6 a.m. and basically the value of what they paid in dropped by 10 or 12%. Like, that went my profit margin.
Exactly. Yeah, it can be, especially if you're very competitive. So yeah, if you want to have competitive markets, you need stable currency.
Now, I find the relationship and the correlation between HBD and Hive to be very unique, and also I think it satisfies a lot of properties. And I understand, getting back to the hard fork, one of the things that is going to take place, are we going to raise the haircut level?
Yeah, we're raising it from 10 to 30%.
Okay. Before we jump into what I was going to get to, maybe you should explain for those who are listening or watching who don't understand, what is the haircut level so that everybody's familiar what we're talking about.
Okay, so the haircut level is a defensive mechanism built into the blockchain. And the reason it's there is basically you're allowed to convert Hive-backed dollars into Hive. And what we don't want is a situation where somebody could basically, if Hive fell very temporarily down in price a long ways, somebody could just take their HBD that accumulated and generate a huge amount of Hive, basically an amount that would allow them to even say take over the blockchain potentially. So there needed to be some kind of limit on how far the conversion would go to prevent that kind of thing. And so the haircut limits that. And basically it says that it puts an upper limit on how much Hive can be generated relative to the amount of Hive that's already out there. And so in this case, it's 10%. So you can't generate more than 10% of the supply basically by converting HBD to Hive. And so that's what if you convert it at all. So basically that's what that haircut does is it sets how far Hive can fall relative to HBD before you just won't be able to get that much Hive for it. It's an inflation control mechanism. And the reason it's done there is there's a fear there could be something called a death spiral, which is somebody takes their HBD, creates it to Hive, then starts selling that Hive off, which drives the price further down. Then they convert more of their HBD at the lower price, and they could just generate more and more. There's just various scenarios there that could be problematic if it got out of hand. Now, the level was set at 10%, which was really super, super conservative. It's beyond anything really, but I guess at the time there wasn't any real strong need or desire to push HBD. It was a lot of people weren't really sure about its usefulness. And so I think that's why the 10% got set that way. But I've never thought it was really reasonable at that level. And it's hard to say what is reasonable because it's this theoretical threat that makes setting any kind of haircut level. But I think at 30%, I'm quite confident that's not at all risky. I don't see a scenario that could cause a real problem. But then of course you might say, well, what's wrong with 10%? Why not, or even 1%? Why do we care about? Why don't we have any risk? Why don't we just totally absolutely reduce our risk? And the problem is the haircut limit does put a risk to HBD itself. So it risks its stability. So if you start to approach the haircut limit as a HBD holder, you might be thinking, well, if we go over the haircut limit, my HBD is no longer worth $1. I can only get a lesser amount of Hive. So it is a stability risk for the price of Hive itself. So we don't really want the haircut limit to be exceeded because then HBD breaks its peg. And that is the ultimate risk for all HBD holders is essentially the haircut. So
yeah, and I would say that risk, and like you said, it was set super conservative, but maybe that made sense when there was a lot less Hive out there, and you're not dealing with the numbers you're dealing with now, and I think your risk is mitigated the more the blockchain grows in terms of the tokens that are out there, the value of everything, the number of people holding it, where it's being held, and things of that nature. That it just as distribution takes place, the risk level will decrease, even though theoretically it's still there.
Yeah, because there's more buyers for Hive, which means that somebody couldn't take HBD, convert it to Hive, and then dramatically drive down the price anymore because the market's more liquid. It's more accepting of Hive. So yeah, that's absolutely true that as Hive is more desired and there's more people buying and selling it, then the risk from HBD conversions definitely drops a lot.
Well, and also from a governance standpoint, we're all a little scarred and we're more aware of what could come from an outside threat. And from a governance perspective, the more Hive that is in more wallets and locked up in Hive power, while that reduces the liquidity on the open market, it does provide another layer of defense for the ecosystem, because then we can't get sock puppet witnesses and stuff like that, because there's enough people holding Hive power that it's like, go get yourself 20 million Hive powered up. Still, what are you going to do? Because there's 200 million powered up.
Yep, that's true. Definitely true.
Now, what do you think are some of the limitations to HBD at this point? Where are we still lacking? Obviously, the peg is it's better, but it's still a little loose.
Yeah, I'm actually happy with the peg personally. I know people are concerned, but I think in the raising of a few percent, that's really no different than plenty of sovereign currencies out there that have no problem doing trading. I mean, I deal in Canadian dollars and euros a lot, and I can tell you they vary against the dollar.
Not very well lately either. Judging by the dollar.
Yeah, and the zlotys, rupees. You
got yourself any Turkish lira right now?
I do not.
Thankfully so.
But I do pay people in those other currencies. So, and it's not a problem. And those people are then happy to spend those currencies and so it's the stability of HBD. I think like I said, I think the only threat to HBD's price really is the haircut. So we've kind of removed one of the last by increasing the haircut up. I think we'll basically eliminate one of the larger risks to HBD that still exists. So that I think will increase the supply too, potentially. So I think that's going to stabilize. I think that will actually just in itself stabilize the price of HBD more. I think it'll tighten the peg because the risk is lowered. I mean, right now, I wouldn't buy HBD if we were near their haircut right now, for instance. But, we're twice over the haircut. I think it's a great buy. And if we triple the haircut, then, then now we're further away. It just makes it more solid buy, easier to buy. I mean, you don't have to, you're not risking as much. And so that's naturally going to increase the upper side of the peg, which is where I think we see the weakness right now. Right now, we see usually HBD a little bit below $1. It's really, we don't really see it. I mean, we can't go too far above $1 because we have the instant conversion with the collateral on the other side that just really pegs it hard at 1.05.
Yeah, it does. And, a lot of people have complained about the conversion time and, maybe that's something to look at down the road. But again, if you're trying to arbitrage HBD, you don't have to use the conversion mechanism to arbitrage it. You can use the internal exchange, or if you're on an external exchange, you can use that. So
yeah, it works great, and there are plenty of people doing that.
Yeah, that's what HBD stabilizers doing is arbitraging it all day
They're not
long.
the only ones. I've seen a number of actors out there doing this kind of trades. So I think the weakness on the downside is really a little bit of the haircut, and I think with the haircut increasing, that we'll see a little bit of decrease there. And if we don't, I'll be arbitraging it some. So,
one of the things that I've written a number of posts about this. In fact, I got another post in mind on it because I'm with you. I think HBD not only is extremely important to Hive, I think it's a fabulous opportunity because first off, we have the regulatory environment, which it's evident they're going after all the stable coins and they're going to make them fall under, whether it's Circle, whether it's Tether Foundation. They're going to have to be under the banking regulations. I don't think there's any way around that. But HBD, it's like, okay, good luck reining that one in because it's basically
nobody's behind it, nobody backing it.
Yeah, it's basically just code on the blockchain, and it's tied to another blockchain token. And it's not a layer 2. There's nobody behind it. But one of the things that I see is if you're going to be a legitimate stable coin, and just looking at the number of USDC out there and Tether, and then you look at the float on HBD, especially when you remove what's in the DAO right now, we're going to need a hell of a lot more HBD. And yes, the conversion mechanism is part of that, but converting all the Hive over to HBD, while it may sound great in theory, and great, the price of Hive will go up, less Hive, all that, people forget that, Hive powered up is required to operate on this chain. So if we're talking about scaling, you need a lot of resource credits to operate on chain. And right now it's not a problem because most of us who have any type of high power don't use nearly all of our resource credits, and that the delegational help for applications and being delegated to them. But Hive itself does have utility above and beyond the governance. It actually has utility. It's in effect our gas. High power is effectively
Yes.
our gas capability. So how do you look at HBD expanding tremendously without killing the utility of the Hive token, i.e. the ability to operate on chain? My belief is we have a tremendous opportunity in the fixed income market. And since HBD is a base layer token, we actually can do a lot of things in the fixed income market that nobody else can because we're doing it at the base layer. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. So, I mean, there's two pieces of this picture, right? There's utility, so driving demand for HBD, and I think that's the piece you're talking about. Really, is finding ways to utilize HBD's value for services, or providing services, whatever.
Commerce.
Right? And the second, to increase the amount, is that of course we've got because it's backed ultimately by Hive. Hive's price has to go up too, in order for us to keep increasing the amount of HBDs out there. Otherwise, it becomes a risk factor, right? That's why that's the whole point for the haircut. So now that can be a virtuous cycle. If we create more utility for HBD and more people want to, trade in and do things with it, then that can also drive up the price of Hive, because people can say, well, Hive's back in HBD and you need Hive to do HBD transactions. So, but ultimately, so to increase the supply of HBD, I think, utility is where you start. And I think as more people want to use HTTP, that's going to be a driver for increasing the price of Hive, and therefore you can create more HBD as a result, and HBD can expand to meet demand. The supply of HBD.
I've been saying it's kind of the chicken or the egg, and where do you focus first? Because you need more demand, but without use cases, there's really not going to be the demand.
Use cases, utility has to be first, in my opinion. I think you can create all the HBD in the world, but if nobody has a use for it, then what's it lie?
Yeah, and there is that point to it, that you start driving demand, and then you can figure out ways for creating more. I think another use case, and because of the transparency, I think one of the biggest opportunities for this entire discussion in the financial arena is for collateral, because pristine collateral is very limited, and there's a lot of debt out there globally in our financial systems. And as we found out in the great financial crisis, what was used as collateral and thought of as high quality collateral and rated by the rating agencies as high quality collateral ended up being garbage. And with the transparency, and I've thought about this, blockchain code is law. And with HBD, you actually have something that's based on the code. It's transparent. Anybody can read it. You know exactly where it is. And I could see this being, and I wrote about this in terms of the creation of Hive bonds, is an idea I had, where you use the HBD in a locked environment, either in savings or some type of locked account, time locked account, where then you spin off another token for liquidity. You can create a market for that, an exchange for that. And now you have an asset of collateralization. And it's pristine collateral because you know exactly what it is paying and what it's worth, because there's a market for it, a liquid market for it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I mean, there's two different forms of collateral, I guess, normally. I mean, so I guess the general collateral market is like, collateral for something that is providing utility to you already that you still have, like a building or something like that. So, I mean, you can't replace the collateral for a building with collateral for HBD, because you need the building still. But yeah, I think there are plenty of cases probably too where you could at least show that you had assets that they're locked up in some form, and you probably could create some kind of you could certainly create some kind of contract theoretically that would allow it to pay out or something like that. So it's how to tie that to, the thing is that's going to require something on the first layer normally, or you'd have to create something, you'd have to create basically a trustworthy second layer, which is possible. It's one of the things I've been giving a lot of thoughts to lately is how to create trustworthy second layer systems. And so, I mean, we're going to see a need for that eventually. So right now, I mean, the simplest way to, this gets into a complicated issue, and I'm guessing we don't have time for this. How long do we have?
Yeah, whatever works for you. I mean, John and I don't have much life, so
Well, I didn't know if we had
kids are
scheduled time for
quiet.
this.
So, and the USPs are quiet on your end, so I guess we can keep going on until kids or USPs start screaming.
Okay, so this gets back to more blockchain theory, I guess, which seems to be the most of this call is going to be. So, there's gets to be an issue with second layer versus first layer. How do they interact with each other? So, say I've got Hive. The second layer sees everything that happens to Hive, but Hive doesn't see everything that happens on the second layer. So, you could, for instance, you could have a system where you paid Hive to get the second layer token, for instance, and the second layer token system could see the Hive transaction where, say, it makes a transaction from the buyer to the seller, and the seller is, say, the second layer system, and the second layer system can then credit them with second layer tokens or give them some second layer functionality, authority, whatever. It can be anything, but that's a transparent transaction to both sides. Both sides see that Hive got transferred to the second layer, but Hive doesn't see anything about what that second layer is now doing with it. So it doesn't see what it's done as a result. So what happens? So if the second layer wants to send that Hive back to the first layer, to somebody on the first, send Hive back to anyone or send Hive somewhere, it has to sign those transactions with keys. And second layer systems on their own don't normally sign with keys.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have somebody, it has to be somebody who actually has a secret key. And if you share that secret key out to everybody in the world, then it wouldn't be a secret key. So you get into this issue of how do you handle transactions on the first layer from a second layer system? And you can do it. So the first simple way is you can have an account on Hive, and it's a centralized account that processes transactions, that sees transactions on the second layer and might, say, pay out Hive to somebody. So it's got a key, it's running on this guy's server, and he's every time he sees a second layer transaction goes on. So like you might be running an exchange, for instance, and you could see stuff that happens. You could have a second layer decentralized trading exchange. And when you see that there's been a withdrawal of Hive, your account could then, your exchange account could then send Hive to that guy, right? I hope this is clear. So, but what if you want to, I mean, the problem there is just one guy doing the signing, and if he goes away, then all those tokens don't mean anything on the second layer, right? If you had Swap Hive or, something like that, if the guy who's processing Swap Hive transactions goes away, you no longer can get Hive for them. So then what you need to do is decentralize that single point. So you can set up a multi-sig account that's basically multiple people can sign, maybe a majority or whatever. And so you can decentralize the same way we decentralize transaction processing on Hive itself. So, and then you could even have a second layer beyond that. You could have a voting system. You could make it a DPoS. So you could set up basically a DPoS on a second layer system where you vote with the tokens of the second layer system for who's has the signing authority to process those transactions that send stuff back to Hive.
Yeah, so you're replicating the system. You're just doing it at the second layer, so not as to mess with the blockchain.
Yeah, you've got a governance. All you've got at the second layer is the governance system. That's not everything that's in Hive by a long shot.
Yeah,
you don't have the peer-to-peer system. You don't have all the the base layer transaction stuff. But yeah, you're basically the governance part of it. You can reproduce a DPoS governance model without probably too much difficulty at a second layer. So that might be like one thing we might create as a half app is a second layer DPoS like template that you could pick up, and then you could just modify it and run your own DPoS system as a second layer, and be able to have interactions with the base layer through that DPoS system.
Gotcha. Well, I have some ideas in this realm, and maybe we'll get and talk off
the
air.
reason I mentioned this is because just to get back, the reason I mentioned this is because some of the things you're talking about with being able to do these kind of first layer things, you can achieve this way, I think. So you could write second layer, you can write a second layer system, have all your logic on the second layer, and then you just build a DPoS communications signing layer to get transactions back to the base layer. So you could have a Hive, you could have a HBD collateral system built on the second layer that then interacts with the first layer through this DPoS, second layer DPoS system.
Well, I can throw the ideas at you, and I'll leave the technical details to you because that's kind of out of my expertise. What about what do you know about the account signups and some of the onboarding? And people have been saying there's been a bit of an issue there. What are your views on that?
I think there have been problems, and I think there probably still persist problems in sign up. That's for sure. As far as solving them, I've had various ideas. I mean, personally, I always favored a pay for sign up system rather than just giving out free accounts. I think it's difficult problem to, there's always people who are out there, bad actors who are trying to get accounts because Hive accounts are valuable. And if you hand them out for free, it's a very difficult job to vet them to be sure that they're not scammers. So unfortunately, if it wouldn't be so bad if there's just one scammer per 100 users, legitimate users, which is probably the real situation. But the problem is that one scammer can grab hundreds, thousands of accounts each, while the legitimate guys are only grabbing one each. So it's more of a problem. Just even a few bad actors can easily compromise a free account system unless you've got some really good way to verify how you're handing out those free accounts. I'm not saying there's not such a system possible, but I don't know if I've seen a good one that we've employed right now. I think they're all the ones we've got now have real problems. And I think that's one of the roots of the problems is the attempts to give out free accounts without a great validation system.
And you bring up a point that, and I did write a post about this. What is the value of a Hive account? And, a lot of people who are new may not see it, but when you think about it, where you have one login to, all the different applications, if you are doing social media or business building, your followers follow you no matter what the application, immutable posting, your account is yours. It can't be taken away. All assets in your account are yours and can't be taken away.
And provable too, right? So like you're getting back to the collateral, you can show somebody, look, I have this account. You can prove you control it. I have this money here. You can literally prove that you have money to pay for something, for instance.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
which is, how do you do that with normally you have to bring cash to somebody? You just like, look, I've got all this cash here in my hands.
Yeah, I got it hidden in my mattress because I'm Canadian, right, John? John put all his Canadian dollars under his box spring here last week.
I mean, you can't even just do something easy like say, call my bank up and they'll tell you I've got $10,000 in there. The bank is not going to respond to that.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, that comes back to, are we entering with this, I'll throw out the umbrella Web3, are we entering this world where, I mean, you go to Web2, Facebook and Twitter and YouTube will give you they'll all give you a free account, but there's strings with it. And, there's conditions and they have a term of service. And
at the end of the day, you don't own that account. They own your account.
Yeah, if they gave it to you, you don't own it. They own it. And not only
they're not giving you an account, but they're giving you ability to transact with their service that they can take away at any time and control it any way they want.
Yeah, and they monetize it. They make money off of it. You don't.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
it's a very different thing.
That is a question. Is there going to be a new mindset developing that says, hey, by coming to Hive, okay, maybe I got to pay $3 for an account. But, instantly I have $20 or $25 worth of value even before I start doing anything.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's I think like an invite system is another thing we can look at. But, basically, so in ways to invite your friends, right? So those, I think that's less subject to, the kind of manipulation. But again, I mean, how do you vet the guy for invites, right? Because you have to deal with that too. So say the original guy who gets the invites is a scammer. He invites fake people. Then do they get invites too? And so any kind of system you make like that, you have to have some kind of, there still comes back to a vetting process with those kind of things. So yeah, I think payment system, I think is not a bad way to do it. It's certainly one of the simplest ones we can do now. Now, one of the things we probably could do right now is simplify paying right now. Especially right now, we need more services where you can pay in fiat, basically, because if we're attracting new people who don't know anything about crypto, then they know how to make a credit card payment, but they don't necessarily know how to make an Ethereum payment or a Bitcoin payment or one of those kind of things. So I think that's an area where we could use some improvement. And I mean, there's been some stuff in that direction. I think maybe Roland, for instance, had a app like on maybe the Apple Store, I forget, that I think you could pay in euros. So such services can exist, but I think we could use more of those.
Yeah, well, if you use Ethereum, then your Hive account only costs you $203.
Yeah, transaction fee of $17.
$200 transaction fee and $3
$3 account.
Yeah, that's why John loves Ethereum. Just to start wrapping up here, if you want to give us, you already gave us some insight. You have mid-April-ish, hard fork and half going live at the same time. After that, you're going to switch your focus to some of these layer 2, including smart contract. But throw out some highlights. What is going to be your focus for the rest of the year?
Definitely the smart contract is one of the biggest ones. So we'll basically scope it out first. So figure out what we want to do at the first release, and then we'll build on. So we'll set up a roadmap of how we'll release it, and because obviously we like to get something out there as fast as possible, but so it's a matter of deciding what's the minimum features we need in order to do a release, and what. So I don't have an estimate on the time yet, because we need to do that step first in order to know just what it means to do a release, and then we can say how long it'll take. The other thing I'm planning on starting this year is the reputation system that I mentioned before. So we'll be starting on that. Now, I don't want to confuse people here, and I think that there often is this confusion, is the idea this might be some replacement for the Hive reputation system that's out there. I'm not saying it can't replace that, and it might be used for that, but it goes a long ways beyond that. That's just kind of a thing that could be done in the side. It's really not a Hive project per se. Although, because I work heavily with Hive, I don't doubt, Hive users will be introduced to it and things like that. So, we'll probably make some Hive integrations, I guess you could say. But in general, it is just a peer-to-peer system. But like one of the things it could be useful for, Hive could be useful for, is coming back to the value of Hive accounts, is when you want to develop, if you want to develop your reputation of a person, then you need some way to say, how do you know when that person's acting, when they're doing something? So a Hive account is a way of, you can do provable transactions with keys that say this is this person doing this thing. So I've always planned to have the reputation system built in the ability to handle processing of blockchain transactions and recognizing actions taken by people on a blockchain. So obviously we're going to start with Hive for doing that, just because we know all about Hive and it's really fast and it's got a lot of users and all those kind of things. So, by the way, I think that's another thing that sometimes bugs me. People think there's only I think people are underestimating the number of users on Hive occasionally. Mainly because I think they look at these daily activity counts for how many people are on Hive. But I mean, not everybody's going to interact on Hive every single day. So I feel that's undercounting quite a bit. I think the monthly and even, bi-monthly is probably a more realistic count of people who are actually Hive users.
Yeah, but in the realm of the internet, it's still a very
in the realm of the internet, it's small, but it still can be a factor of 4.
Well, and I think ultimately you just look at how Hive has stood up. There is no doubt, whatever the number, it is a loyal and dedicated community.
Oh, that's absolutely true. And I mean, we're still seeing growth too. So So one of the growth metrics I see is the hits on api.hive.blog and hive.blog itself. So I can see how we're, especially the accounts on hive.blog are interesting because those are showing us like, more people, viewers, and things like that. We've seen a steady increase over time. That's been a
Well, everybody wants the moonshot and the rocket, and hey, how do we get 5 million people here tomorrow? And
yeah, it's slower process than that. We basically we find more use cases. That's the answer always.
Yeah, and even if we had 5 million people interested, we couldn't give out 5 million accounts. I mean, it's unless they were paying $3 a piece worth of Ethereum.
Yeah, so onboarding is definitely a problem that has to be solved along with it. I mean, right? I think somewhat if the demand is high enough, onboarding is not as much of a problem because people will fight harder through more obstacles to get their account. But at the same time, yeah, we also should make that barrier to entry easier, lower, so that they don't have to be such a demand to get new people. We need to attack both problems.
Yeah, we still have some infrastructure, some foundation pieces. Final question: what are you most excited about with Hive? If you had to pick maybe a couple things, what when you think about Hive in the future and what we have brewing here, what really gets you excited?
I don't know. That's a hard one because it's a lot of different things. I mean, usually it's related to my own personal projects, and that's partly because that's where I'm devoting my labor and because I'm passionate about them. So I am very interested in how Hive can link up to the reputation system, because the reputation system is really one of the things I've wanted to do for a while. It has a lot of impacts. And so, but I think we do need an authorization kind of system in it to prove identity and things like that. And I think having Hive work as part of that and being a feeder for the reputation system, I think is really important.
Is that reputation system? Would I be remiss in calling it a proof of person?
That's one thing it can do. It can do lots of different things. It's very open-ended in terms of its applications, but certainly proof of identity, is definitely there. And that can be different types of proof too. You could have proof of real world, like this is the real person, but you could have another proof of identity as this is the guy who's known as this in the world, but doesn't mean that's John Doe. It just means that this guy that you've been speaking, who's Blocktrades, this is really Blocktrades speaking right now, but who knows who Blocktrades is? So you can have anonymous identities, you can have real world identities, you can have both in a system like this. But again, that just starts to scratch the surface of the things I'm planning for this system.
Yeah, I've thought it, one of the steps in the future that needs to be taken, it seems to me, we know that privacy has been obliterated online, and as more stuff goes online, as we decentralize more data, transparency is a great thing in some regards, but it's not a great thing in other regards.
You're absolutely right. Well, lots of things, like saying bad things about your boss.
Or saying bad things about your boss. Web 3.0 is going to change it. We don't have bosses. We work for ourselves, and we make money by upvoting. And
there's always people you may have to do. They may not be your boss, but they may be somebody you have to do business with. That you also have. You feel that you have other things you'd like to share about them unrelated to that business transaction. So there will always be a need for some amount of privacy of information, and but still, you would be nice to be able to share information even in a private way. That's actually one of the that's actually one of the complicated subjects involved in designing the reputation system, is how to deal with that exact problem. The problem between the need for anonymity of where the data is coming from, but verifiability of the data and ability to, share that data while being anonymous or pseudo-anonymous or, some form. So those are real world design problems associated. There are solutions though. There are absolutely for sure solutions to that.
Well, what I was going to is, I think we need some type of digital ID system, but that has those components in there, because there's certain things that, yes, having it very public and transparent is great, but there's other things like medical records that totally private, and only share with certain people, and other things. And yeah, I guess it is complex. So we'll give you 6 weeks instead of 4 to complete it.
But yeah, you're entirely correct. A lot of this will evolve about how you decide what to share with whom. There's a lot of that going on in this system. Is you're not going to share all your information with everybody. You're going to share it with your friends, and not even everything with every friend, right? It's going to be more selected than that. And then sometimes you might want to share stuff in a way that makes it more anonymous, so you can have aggregation of data so that somebody can see that there's a result coming out of the system, but they don't know where the inputs came from. But there's a guy that you trust who's aggregating that data. So he's basically stamping he's saying, I'm not lying. This is the data I'm getting. So he now has a reputation associated with aggregating data privately, but honestly. Mm-hmm. And then somebody could, those things can be challenged too. So it is a complicated system. There's a lot of, you can make a very simple one that's very transparent. Everybody sees everything, and you could start with that. But very rapidly, a lot of the most important data that you might want to share is sensitive to the source.
Yeah. So it sounds like you have some big plans and some big projects on your plate. John, anything from the peanut gallery on any of the?
It's pretty funny when you guys were talking about that, and Blocktrades is like, who is this guy? That was actually a question in my Telegram. They're like, he's like a secret witness, huh? He never shows his camera. I'm like, trust me, he does exist. He's a real person.
See, we have to explain. He has a full head of hair, and our new policy is if you have a full head of hair,
not allowed on. No.
You're just audio only. Don't make us look any worse than we are.
Yeah, I had to make it clear
for a long time.
He's a real person does exist. So
yeah, he can find video out there of me, I guess. I think if he searches around, they'll pop up. I don't do a lot of video, but it does pop up every once in a while.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add that you want to let people know that you're thinking about or working on, or tidbits about Hive or anything like that?
Well, I think we covered the main things. Hard Fork 26 coming out April. After that, we begin work on reputation system and on the smart contract system. Other than that, we've got more performance tweaks along the way. Still got the secret one, which I haven't talked about. That's actually the big delay right now, and I think we'll probably be starting on that, I want to say, hopefully next week. And that's probably going to take us 2 or 3 weeks. And that's essentially a performance improvement, but it requires a protocol change. So that's why it's got to be part of the hard fork, unfortunately. And other than that, I think that's about it right now. I guess I'll mention we've added some more programmers. So we've got more guys working on Hive nowadays than we added 2 not too long ago. And we're adding more to our general staff and trying to get everybody, even the guys who aren't directly working on Hive, we're starting to introduce them more into the Hive environment just so that they're Hive capable, I guess. So that's about it.
Do you see this blockchain being a major force in the future?
Yeah, honestly, I want to use Hive and the reputation system to change the world entirely.
Oh, okay. We like those people with small goals.
You have to have aspirational goals, and that's mine.
Well, that's a great thing about the digital world. You can target an audience of like 5.25 billion people.
Yeah, it's truly a different world we live in now. That's for sure. The chances for change are much higher than they were in the past.
Well, we thank you for your time and coming on, and you're always welcome here. Anytime you have any tidbits or insight you want to let everybody know about and drop. I think, John, what are we now? We got about 95 million viewers. We dropped a couple weeks ago, and I think Joe Rogan passed us again on Spotify. But yeah, that happens.
Yeah, we have goals too. right?
We're going after Joe. Although we gotta
Joe.
be nice. He's got hair like we do, John. So we gotta don't bash the ball, guys.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, it was great, man. Appreciate you coming by, and thanks for all the work you do. You know, we're grateful for it, and especially when you just left us with that gem where I want to change the world with this. That's kind of like, you know, you hear that from you, it's like, we're in a good spot here, guys.
Go out and buy some Hive. Not financial advice, but go buy some Hive. Not a bad idea. It's on sale right now.
Mm,
Well, guys,
sure.
thanks for having me on the show. I enjoyed it.
for sure.
Thank you.
Take care.